This essay will examine how contemporary films portray the value and power of the image as a tool for reconstructing past oppressive images or assumptions about a culture by examining Godland and Embrace of the Serpent. These films use the image to shape and change the narrative around a country or people through a dual process. They first portray characters who are only informed by the existing images of a culture, Iceland and Godland, indigenous people in the Amazon and Embrace of the Serpent, and then reveal the missing picture through their film's visual content. Though not technically a part of third cinema, these films accomplish this by conveying similar ideals and trends to those within that cinematic movement, such as the manipulation of space, narratives of transformation, and the reconstruction of the image. Embrace of the Serpent is writer-director Ciro Guerra's third feature film, released in 2015. It follows Kara Makate, an indigenous Amazonian shaman, in 1909 and 1940 as he encounters two different Western men looking for the sacred plant Yacruna. Guerra drew on numerous Amazonian cultures to inform the fictional Chihuahua people. In an interview with Cineast magazine, he says that as the writing process went on, he understood the need to tell the indigenous story, which hadn't yet been told. In restructuring the narrative to, quote, feel more like an Indian tale than a normal film, however, he realized a wider audience wouldn't understand the story. Quote, I would lose the connection to them because it's such a different way of storytelling and understanding. I understood that the film needed to be a bridge. It had to talk to the viewer in a way. This explains the sometimes unsure identity of the film, oscillating between a portrayal of indigenous culture from the indigenous perspective and a sometimes soulless reproduction of white indigenous relation narratives. For instance, while including scenes of Kara Makate passing down indigenous knowledge to indigenous children who have been told they must never interact with their culture, the ending in which he transfers knowledge to the white American man, Evan, seems to recenter the film on the white perspective. This is especially true with the butterfly parallel the director makes between Kara Makate earlier in the film and Evan in the end to illustrate the transfer of knowledge from the former to the latter. This choice visually paints the two characters as equals in their ownership of the knowledge, a problematic notion considering Guerra intended to tell an indigenous story, yet one that makes sense within the context of his statements about realizing he needed to talk to the viewer. Even with these compromises, though, the film makes an argument for the power of the image, reconstructing past offensive and uninformed portrayals of indigenous culture. Godland, released in 2022 and written and directed by Hilner Palmason, portrays a similar narrative of exclusion and inclusion. The film centers on Lucas, a Lutheran Danish priest who is sent to establish a church in Iceland and has his faith tested by the grueling elements and his own desires. It also explores past relations between Denmark and Iceland, with Denmark as colonizer and Iceland as colonized. The characters and the landscape itself resist Lucas's colonial efforts, with the elements nearly killing him, and Ragnar ultimately succeeding in doing so. The image acts as its own character in the story. At the beginning, the title card claims, a box was found in Iceland with 7 wet plate photographs taken by a Danish priest. These images are the first photographs of the southeast coast. This film is inspired by these photographs. And throughout the film, Lucas takes multiple images using the collodion process, intentionally portraying a particular image of Iceland, one he finds acceptable. But in his direction, Palmason shows the audience what Lucas does not want us to see, the beauty and community of Iceland. As contemporary art films, the two films are arguably more in line with second cinema, but as films that change the narrative around a country or people and reflect certain characteristics of third cinema, which will be covered shortly, they are more aligned with that movement. One such characteristic is a disregard for conventional editing styles to manipulate time. In Towards a Critical Theory of Third World Films, Teshome H. Gabriel states that all films manipulate time and space, but where Western films manipulate time more than space, Third World films seem to emphasize space over time. This is displayed in both films. In Embrace of the Serpent, it's reflected in the use of two timelines. The filmmaker alternates between scenes in 1909 and 1940, but draws parallels between the two, manipulating space in the frame. The constant in these times is Kara Makate. Thus, the film recenters the image surrounding Amazonian indigenous people to be on the people themselves, not their colonizers. In Godland, the film intentionally takes its time, allowing viewers to absorb the beauty and tranquility of the Icelandic countryside, even as it tests Lucas. As Gabriel continues, Third world films grow from folk tradition where communication is a slow-paced phenomenon and time is not rushed but has its own pace, he says. In contrast, Western culture values time significantly more, meaning that, if time drags in a film, spectators grow bored and impatient, so that a method has to be found to cheat natural time. He continues that the editing style used to combat this is all based on the idea that the more purely non-dramatic elements in film are considered cinematic excess. However, the editing of Godland embraces these non-dramatic elements. The film contains a multitude of slow scenes which center the landscape and ultimately do not serve a unifying purpose, but thus exemplify this third cinema ideal without the film being from the third world. Through these choices in both films, they make audiences see these images of landscapes and people through the lens of the colonized, providing a reclamation of the image and a redefining of their narratives. Another third cinema convention present in both films is narratives of transformation. In Toward the Third Cinema, Notes and Experiences for the Development of a Cinema of Liberation in the Third World, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Gattino write that this cinema style provides discovery through transformation because it intervenes in a situation instead of passively documenting it. This transformation takes many forms in the films in question. For instance, Guerra intervenes in the prevailing image of indigenous communities and colonizers, or Westerners, minds by re-educating viewers through the inclusion of the indigenous perspective. In this way, he transforms the existing image and thus gives audiences a chance to discover these indigenous customs and cultures. Lucas is transformed in quite a different way. He begins the film with unbridled naivety, but becomes increasingly resentful of Iceland, its landscape, people, and language. In Discourse on Colonialism, Amy Césaire states that colonization dehumanizes even the most civilized man. By the end of his transformation, the audience has discovered this lack of humanity within Lucas. This is exemplified in his refusal to photograph Ragnar, the Icelandic man who has been guiding him throughout his arduous journey, when he calls him a brainless swine. This is in accordance with Césaire's observations. He claims, "The colonizer, who in order to cease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal." Lucas's transformation is also palpable in the wrestling scene, in which he takes part in the local men's tradition. When he wrestles Karl, a Dane, it's all in good fun. But when he goes to wrestle Ragnar, his true nature is revealed. As Caspar Salmon put it for Sight and Sound, we see this slight man's tenacious determination finally win out over his diffidence, marking his metamorphosis into a very different sort of creature to the jejune character who set out on his journey. Salmon perfectly articulates Lucas's journey and the film's relation to third cinema. His narrative of transformation is one in which he succumbs to his own biases and ignorance, unable to see the beauty in the culture around him. Palmerston does not just passively establish the situation of colonization. He intervenes by revealing the harm a colonization mindset can do and picturing the beauty colonizers miss out on due to these biases and their own dehumanization. Through their films, the artists epitomize the two-step process of destruction and reconstruction, which defines third cinema. In the words of Solanas and Gattino, this cinematic movement necessitates destruction of the image that neocolonialism has created of itself and of us, and construction of a throbbing, living reality which recaptures truth in any of its expressions. In Embrace of the Serpent, Guerra intentionally destroys the existing image of the indigenous communities he portrays. In Western minds, there is a notion of an idealized, peaceful coexistence between indigenous people in the Amazon and their environment, according to Enrique Albites in his paper about indigenous narratives in the film. But in the film, there is no such idealization because that is a projection of the guilt complex of the Western cultures, says Albites, which is not the perspective Guerra wants to highlight. Instead, there are multiple scenes in the film of violence. Karmakate destroys almost all of the Yacruna flowers, for example. Other natural forces exhibit this violence as well. In Albites' words, this is not peaceful coexistence, but evidence that the balance of life in the Amazon is far from some Western imagined ecological peace. Thus, Guerra destroys the common image of indigenous Amazon cultures by refuting this peaceful Western fantasy. The other step, reconstruction, is constantly reflected in his formal choices. On a base level, the entire film, besides Evan's hallucination at the end, is in black and white. This is reminiscent of the beginnings of film, reflecting Guerra starting from scratch and telling the indigenous story. It is a rebirth of cinema from a new perspective, one which hasn't been shown or prioritized thus far. Beyond making the film visually striking, the color choice represents the idea that this film is just the beginning in reconstructing history from the indigenous perspective, adding the missing image of this community. Godland has a similar pattern of destruction and reconstruction. In taking his photos, which intentionally frame Iceland in an exclusionary way, reflecting Lucas's Danish biases and ignorance, Lucas creates this neo-colonial image of the nation. However, Palmerston destroys this image by portraying Lucas's hardships against the Icelandic elements, showing Iceland's strength and Lucas's ignorance. He also does this in his killing of Lucas at the hands of an Icelandic man, Ragnar, who he previously disrespected and used dehumanizing language against. Palmerston reconstructs a positive image of Iceland through picturesque landscape shots highlighting the environment's beauty. As Salmon puts it, Palmerston performs the minor miracle of making these sorts of everyday occurrence ineffably beautiful. In gorgeously tinctured, boxy images that mimic early photography, the director consistently transfigures reality. In this way, he reconstructs the image of Iceland Lucas wants to believe by conveying a contrasting image to audiences through the aspect ratio and rounded corners of the frame, which mimic the photographs Lucas takes. While both Embrace of the Serpent and Godland are contemporary art films, they utilize techniques and ideals of the Third Cinema movement in order to reconstruct past oppressive images of a culture. The films prove the power of the image as a tool for this reconstructive process, using it to change the narrative around a country or people.